I think everybody knows by now, if you've been listening to Resilient, that I live in California. I've lived here my entire life, other than a few years when I lived in Connecticut. And when I think about it, the reason is really simple. The weather, I don't think that there is a place in this entire world with better weather. Or the things that you can do. One day you could be up in Napa, the next day you could be up on a lake, you could go to Tahoe, the beaches, San Francisco, Southern California. There's just so many different things that you can do. But we've, as you probably have seen, have had some challenges in California. I think everybody has probably witnessed from afar, unless like me, you live in California, the number of natural disasters that we've been exposed to over the last several years. Think about the Tubbs fire back in 2017. I had an incredible conversation on that topic with James Gore, the Sonoma County supervisor. Or what about the Camp wildfire just last year, almost at this time, the largest wildfire in California's history? Today, I am unbelievably fortunate to be sitting down with Karen Baker, who is not only an incredible person, but is an incredible leader. She is a senior advisor for disaster volunteering and preparedness at Cal OES, or Office of Emergency Services, an architect and co-chair of the Listos California Emergency Preparedness Campaign, formerly known as the California for All campaign. And for 13 years, she led California Volunteers, which has been focused on many incredible things, including organizing volunteers in the times of a natural disaster. I have got a lot that I want to talk to Karen about. First of all, she has worked for three governors. Three very different governors. I want to get the inside scoop on what it's like working for them, how she even got into this disaster world in the first place, learnings that she has from recent disasters, and some research that she recently commissioned on the challenges of navigating through disaster. And finally, how she is using the Listos California campaign to empower individuals and communities to take accountability for disaster preparedness.
Since 2013, we've had 16. So, I mean, it's exponentially, just like crazy town when it comes to the number of disasters.
Right.
So nonprofits are definitely thinking about this. Philanthropists are thinking about this as they think about how are they going to really invest their dollars and support nonprofit capacity.
Welcome to the Resilient Podcast, where we hear stories from leaders on risk, crisis, and disruption. My name is Mike Kearney. I'm a Deloitte partner based out of San Francisco. That's why today's conversation is so very important to me. This is about our resiliency in the state of California. And I have to say that I am energized by everything that I'm doing at Deloitte. I'm now leading marketing for our risk, financial, and advisory practice. So I'm the CMO. Still spend a lot of time serving clients, and I am going to continue to moonlight on this podcast where I love hearing what CEOs, board members, and other leaders have to say on risk, crisis, and disruption. Today, I am in Sacramento on a beautiful summer day, and I'm really, really looking forward to speaking with Karen, somebody that I've developed a friendship with over the last year. And I think what you're going to find is a bigger-than-life personality, a great sense of humor, humility, but somebody that is unbelievably serious about her work. There's just something about Karen that I think you're going to get to know quickly. So let's get to it, my conversation with Karen Baker. So Karen, I love to start out these interviews with kind of a fun anecdote. So you have worked for three governors. Probably not a lot of people that can say that. Three very different governors. Everybody from Schwarzenegger to Brown to now Governor Newsom. Can you talk about how it's been working for them and how they're different? Maybe just riff on that for a minute.
Absolutely. Well, first of all, I'll begin with saying, government to me is kind of like this instrument that is used to solve community problems, address community issues.
Yep.
And so I see governors as having each unique instruments that they play and styles that they apply, right?
So I can't wait. Well, so you're going to tell us
I'm going to
what
use
the
an
three
analogy.
governors are like. Okay, good.
Well, this is at least through my eyes. So you've got Governor Schwarzenegger, who to me is like that amazing guitarist who in the middle of a rock concert just riffs and does this amazing solo performance. And it's bold and it's global and it blows the house.
So since I said this in the first take, it's kind of like Eddie Van Halen.
Absolutely. That's what I would say Governor Schwarzenegger was like. I mean,
Eddie Van Halen,
he's
right.
just a very bold presence.
Right.
And an incredible leader. Governor Brown to me is much more like the classic pianist.
Yep.
Measured, trained, thoughtful at every point. And yet, when you don't expect it, in those issues that he deeply cares about, like climate, like prison realignment, like the budget, he is going to go Elton John on you. He is going to go with amazing passion, drive that keyboard in a way that you don't expect, and is so bold. So it's not just that he's a quiet, thoughtful player.
Right.
He's both.
Right. And then Gavin Newsom, Governor Newsom, what's he?
Governor Newsom is a percussionist. I mean, he is someone who is so sensitive to the beat of the communities that he is so interested in reaching in a really genuine way. He cares about our diverse communities. He cares about all voices of California. So he's going to want to be playing the maracas. He's going to be playing the triangle. He's going to be doing it all, because he really believes in a California dream where everyone can achieve, their vision of themselves, right? What do they really want? The California dream can be yours.
Yep.
And he wants to be aware of your beat, and he wants to play to it and be sensitive to it and make sure that it's included.
What did you learn from all of them, any of them? Like, what's something that you've taken away?
You know what I've really realized is that regardless of the style of music that's being played, first of all, that government is a very entrepreneurial kind of business. And a lot of people don't think about that when they think about government. They think of it as kind of stale and, boring,
bureaucratic. Yeah.
But I don't see it that way. I see risk taking. I see entrepreneurship. I see civic engagement. I see just amazing problems that are being solved in really, really creative ways.
So let's drill down on that risk taking. So what's a risk that you've seen government take? Because honestly, when I listen to that, I'm not in government. I go, really? Like, people are really taking risks. What's an example of something?
Oh, there's countless problems that I've seen firsthand. I think of Secretary Wade Crowfoot at Natural Resources. When he, during the Brown administration, was leading our drought work. It's actually very complicated work to get all of the different agencies that touch or could impact the drought to come around a common table, agree on strategies, agree on how are we going to really prepare California if there's little to no water, right? And that's a lot of both egos to deal with, a lot of plans you have to put on hold, a lot of new directions that have to be forged. And I just was really, mesmerized by that process.
I think that is a superpower that does not exist as much as it should. A lot of times we all recognize what the problems are. We all have our own solutions. It's those leaders, and I don't think there's many of them, that really could pull people together, get them aligned on a common vision.
Oh my gosh.
And then move forward.
I can count them on one hand.
Yeah.
Like, I honestly can.
I agree with you.
Yeah, no, it's really extraordinary.
So when we talked, and this wasn't in cut one, but when we talked before this interview, you shared some crazy stories, most of which you're not going to share, because maybe if we did this in 10 years and it was a retrospective, then you could. So we'll come back in 10 years. But is there a fun story that maybe you could share with one of the governors?
Oh, sure. I mean, well, I think Governor Arnold Schwarzenegger, in part because it was the first governor I worked for, and I was just starting out some experience that I needed to gain in the disaster realm. I would travel with him, and he was very compassionate and kind and interested in the folks on the ground that were being impacted by any given disaster, and our first responders. CAL FIRE is extraordinary and was, called to so many incidents, and, certainly in 17 and 18 that has exploded even more so. But when I was with him at one incident, he decided that he wanted to take a look at the footprint of a fire. So he called on the director of Cal OES, the Office of Emergency Services, and said, I need a Black Hawk helicopter. let's go over in this field, land it here, and we'll get on it, Karen, and we're going to go look at the footprint of this fire. And it was like I was in a movie, right? Like you're running through a field with Arnold Schwarzenegger, and he's the governor of the state of California, and you're getting on a helicopter, and you're like checking out this footprint of this fire, which was certainly a tragedy to see this fire, but very exciting to be on this helicopter because I had never, ridden in a helicopter with Arnold Schwarzenegger before. That was pretty extraordinary.
This has got to be surreal.
This is very surreal.
Yeah, gosh, you can't make that stuff up.
It was fascinating. Yeah.
So now you have been tapped by Governor Newsom to lead community resiliency and engagement. That's a mouthful.
Yes.
What does that mean? Like, what is your and we're finding
Sure.
Karen in a really interesting inflection point. With this really cool new role, which we could not be happier that we're talking to you today.
I'm so excited. Well, first of all, I think within, a hot minute of becoming governor, he decided to really make community preparedness a top priority. Mm-hmm. And he and the legislature set aside $50 million to build a California for All emergency preparedness campaign that would engage 1 million diverse and vulnerable Californians to really ensure that they were really prepared. And these are in counties, people that lived in counties that were at high wildfire risk, earthquake, and flood risk. And so what this campaign is, and we just finished the part of the challenge, which was getting nonprofits in contracts that we're going to be working in partnership with. What we're going to be doing is really working with people on the ground to really develop a peer-to-peer, neighbor-to-neighbor network so that, let's say you're a Hmong family in Fresno. In order to really learn about an emerging disaster, you might be better informed about that disaster by your Hmong community than necessarily your community emergency manager. Right? Because of both language barriers, cultural barriers,
people who you trust,
you trust. You just nailed it. Yeah. So what I love about this governor is his passion and commitment to ensuring that these vulnerable populations are just well prepared. And that's my job. It's going to be the deputy secretary working over at the California Natural Resources Agency in this, community resiliency role.
You must be pretty excited for this.
I'm like over the top.
Well, and
I'm
the impact
thrilled.
that you can make. I mean, we live in California, so we've experienced all of these natural disasters over the last few years. And I would imagine part of this role is based on the learnings that you've had from these communities that have been impacted. And for those people potentially that have lost family or their own lives.
Oh my God. It is so tragic when you see, just how sad it is, how many communities are now impacted by wildfires, by all of these, whether it's flood, citrus freezes, oil spills. I feel like I've lived through so many different types of disaster. And California, unlike other states, is especially prone to those disasters that seem to hit with no warning. You live in Florida, you can watch the hurricane come your way. I'm not saying that makes it easy because they too have a lot of work they have to do, but they can prepare a bit. But these wildfires that come and hit California, they come without warning, and they just hit, and that's such a different kind of beast to be kind of prepared for.
Absolutely. What do you think? Is there like some broader message that this kind of boots on the ground, connecting the community to disaster preparedness is sending to California? And the reason why I bring that up is, there's many different tactics or strategies that you can have to prepare Californians. And I think what you guys are saying is, listen, if we don't connect with the people that are impacted directly, yes, all of the messaging is great, but it may actually not change behavior or make people more prepared. Is there a message?
Spot on. You're spot on. I mean, what this is really about is people power and people really seeing themselves first and foremost as their own first responder.
Right.
You're really going to have to recognize you're going to have to get yourself and your family to a safe place. You're going to have to pack the bag with the right documents. You're going to have to know where should you go. You're going to have your family plan, all the things that we've been letting folks know. But I think what this last fire, the Camp Fire, really kind of illustrated in a really vibrant way is just how much you're really going to have to take care of yourself. It doesn't mean that local government and state government and federal resources aren't there for you. They are. But California is such a big state.
Right.
And these communities, often at that urban-rural interface, really need to be able to take care of themselves and each other in their communities.
Yeah, I think there's two that I just wrote down 2 words. One is there's almost a message of personal accountability.
Oh, absolutely.
Like, you know what?
Yeah.
Yes, we're here to support you, but it all starts with you.
It does.
And then also, it also starts with leveraging that network of people. I'll just use that word trust again, that you trust in those dire times that you can leverage to help you thrive, or not even thrive, help you just
survive.
get through. Yeah. Survive. Thank you.
Let
That's
alone
a much,
thrive.
much better
Yeah.
word.
No, it's true. It's true.
Karen, one of the things I love to do is I don't think you really can understand leadership styles unless you understand who the person is. And the more that I do this, the more that I appreciate where that person came from. And I could probably do another podcast series on this because there's some interesting through lines. But let's just start with, like, who is Karen Baker? I know that when we were talking in advance of this, like, one of 8 kids from the Midwest. Tell us a bit about that.
Sure. Yes, I'm from this German Catholic clan of 8 kids with a great mom and dad. My mom's 91, my dad's 89. They're in great health. We all live on the West Coast, 4 of us within a mile of each other.
Wow.
There's 27 grandchildren. I mean, it's quite the clan. And we were just raised in a really close community. Almost everyone was German and Catholic on our street. There was over 200 kids. And it had just an amazing sense of community that I really benefited from, and that I, of course, assumed everyone had. Until we moved out to California, to Sacramento. My dad was in the retail industry.
Right.
And that's what brought us out here. And then, of course, you're exposed to so many different, more diverse communities out in California, which I loved.
And so tell me about early days of family life. I know one story you shared with me is the dinner time conversations or dinner table conversations.
So my dad was and mom are both truly incredible and really into kind of thoughtful conversation. And what my dad, because he worked in retail, would often do is he would come home with a customer service problem that he noticed because he was the manager of department stores. And so he would come home and he would give us an example of maybe a poor service that was given to a customer and asked us, almost like in a case study format, what would you have done? And so I was raised, and my siblings, in this kind of interesting cocoon of, you will be sensitive to customers and people because of all of these interesting, situations that we were exposed to through his work, which was incredibly valuable. I am really grateful for that training. I don't have to go to B school.
Well, there's 2 things. One, I'm guessing it probably cultivated a deep sense of empathy for.
Deep.
It's not only the customer, but now the citizen.
Oh, clearly. And that was also augmented. Both he and my mom, who had every excuse to just be at home with their children, because if you have 8 kids, you could certainly argue that. And instead, they were insanely involved in the community, both, United Way, school boards, church councils. And whenever we would even think to complain about the fact that they weren't present at our latest theater production, it would be like, well, don't you understand? You have your brothers and sisters, but most people don't have other people. And we have to be there for them. We have to show up for them. And so that just gets very deeply embedded in your DNA. That's like it penetrates you, like as something that you make a commitment to, a lifelong commitment to. And that's definitely what I've chosen with my life, and I've loved it.
What I love about that is it is a lesson that you think about to this day, and probably back in the day, you could probably like, why are you spending so much time outside of the family? I need you. But it literally has shaped who you are and what you do nowadays.
Oh, I was whining about it, right? Yeah. And then it actually becomes the value that steers my life.
Right.
So for all those parents out there that are worried about that, you just never know how what you're modeling is going to literally shape your child in a way that's truly transformative.
But it's also not even, today we probably spend actually, I don't even want to make any social commentary on this, but we spend probably more time with our kids and trying to help them to that next level than maybe we did back in the day. And maybe a little bit of that, hey, try to figure out on your own. And I also have a life and I could contribute in other ways is not a bad thing.
No, it's not a bad thing. And I think some of that kind of independence that I experienced was really helpful in my journey.
Absolutely. So fast forward, you get involved in disaster. So how the heck, and maybe if you want to kind of talk about how you ultimately got there, that would be great. But how'd you come into the disaster world?
So disaster is only part of what California Volunteers oversees, which was the position that I've been in for 13 years. And I landed there having been really good friends with the guy that had the position before me, a guy named Chuck Supple, who's now at the Department of Juvenile Justice. His partner, Daniel Zingali, is a very dear friend and is leading the governor's communications, marketing, and public engagement. I had met Daniel, and they were looking for someone to lead California Volunteers, which was at the time in Maria Shriver's shop. Her kind of lead role as our first lady at that time to really encourage everyday Californians to be involved in their community. She really wanted it reinvented. She wanted something really bold. And then they ended up adding to the role not only the AmeriCorps and the volunteerism part that people are familiar with, but then the preparedness part.
And why do you think that is? Is that because we can best leverage volunteers to help California be better prepared for a disaster? Or what do you think the rationale was for?
I think the rationale was kind of twofold. There's a lot of really important players that are in that disaster space that we all know their brands, American Red Cross, Salvation Army, and there's also great faith-based players. The Church of Latter-day Saints is incredible. I could go on and on of all these amazing entities that play a very active role. And if that group of folks is not well organized, and if the spontaneous volunteers that often respond to a disaster aren't coordinated, you can have a second disaster on your hands, you know, where all of a sudden thousands of people turn out to try to help, but end up actually becoming a problem for our first responders because they're clogging roads, they're trying to do really wonderful, giving, loving things, but they may be bringing the wrong resources to bear, and so that becomes a challenge.
And so that's why. So it was really to coordinate a lot of the different agencies.
Frankly, Governor Schwarzenegger really decided to elevate my role to a Secretary of Service and Volunteering because of the San Diego fires. He saw firsthand how volunteers, after our first responders are there to, let's say, save life and property, it was volunteers that were, pulling people out of dangerous situations, volunteers that were sheltering people, volunteers that were feeding people. And he said, who is my general of volunteerism? And when he realized there really wasn't one, he said, then I'm going to go ahead and declare it so.
Karen,
get over here. So before you know it, I was the nation's first Secretary of Service and Volunteering because of that San Diego fire incident.
That is incredible. And I think what's interesting is it's not even necessarily volunteers at the time of the disaster. Part of the biggest challenge is volunteers or people to really help the community recover from any of these natural disasters. So the impact that you can have around funneling these resources as appropriate is significant.
It is significant. It's also important for people that are kind of tracking this from a fiscal angle. It's important because what people may not know is when you have like a federally declared disaster, the federal government will pay for like 75% of the costs, but the other 25% has to be paid for by the local community and the state. And some of that cost can be represented by volunteer hours and their value.
Okay.
So if you can track those volunteer hours and literally have a system that literally collects that, you can actually have that be part of the match. And that's really important as we have this onslaught of disaster after disaster. You really are smart from a fiscal lens to take full advantage of this wonderful group of people that want to make a difference.
We've had a lot of disasters, obviously, in California over the years. What was your first one now that you had this new role of being responsible for coordinating all the volunteers?
Oh, the first one was a little bit on the crazy side. It was very interesting. It was the Costco Busan oil spill in the Bay Area. And what made it interesting was just the challenge of passionate Bay Area folks who really cared about their beaches. They cared about the waterfowl.
Yep.
And frankly, we're not accepting what the local folks were saying around and state government was saying around, no, you cannot volunteer. We had some of the most famous pictures show Buddhist monks from a monastery diving over police tape to go save waterfowl and, wash them with Dove soap. And I use that as an example because no one really understands that just how passionate people get because it's their community that's being affected. I don't care what the disaster is, whether it's fire, we saw it in Camp Fire, people doing heroic things, sometimes somewhat ridiculous things, but you don't know it in the moment, right? It's just a person that's trying to help, right? And is just called with their heart to try to assist, but that can be a hard thing to navigate.
Well, so you almost saw a front row in that first disaster. Look at this passion for my community. And it's like, how can I, through my office and role, marshal those people so that they can make the biggest impact?
So it has to be harnessed. It has to be managed. Right. Just like any other part of an incident. So in that situation, there had been in place a rule that said you needed 40 hours of training. And in San Francisco, there's a great volunteer center. John Power runs it, a great guy. And they were able to quickly work with our team, and we negotiated that 40-hour training should be 4 hours. And let's get people, trained, protected, because you've got a mitigation risk of that oil footprint spreading beyond just the beach and into the back of people's cars as they decide to place ducks there, and all kinds of interesting decisions that people make, in the spirit of trying to help. But there's great nonprofits that have that as their distinct role. And so we would much rather that be the right group of folks that are assisting with the, all animal related issues. And instead, let's redirect these well-meaning volunteers to environmental opportunities. Let's make sure that we use this as an opportunity to celebrate volunteerism, but get you into, upcoming opportunities.
Transitions in work, which we've talked about, sometimes represent the best opportunity to kind of reflect back on where you've been. And so you're almost to a certain degree doubling down.
I think that's a word.
I think I just made up a word, and we will not edit this, but you're doubling down on this whole preparedness around disaster.
You bet.
But when you think back on the 13 years, is there something that really stands out, something that you're extremely proud of? It could be something you did, your team did, a special circumstance. What stands out?
Well, I think my team did an extraordinary job working with Cal OES in partnership at the Camp Fire. And I say that because I've never seen such devastation. I think our state hasn't seen that before at that level. We had, I have our director of disaster volunteering and preparedness, Suva Tai, who is literally globally known for his work, working with his colleague Sharon Leone, 30 years with Cal OES, and now works with California Volunteers, who literally lived in paradise for 3 months.
I was going to, do you mind if I interrupt you?
No, go.
So I think most Californians would know what the Camp Fire was.
Yes,
Can you just maybe just
Absolutely.
share at a high level? You don't need to go on all the details, but some context.
Sure. This was just California's most devastating wildfire that hit in Butte County in a town called Paradise and also surrounding communities. And it spread incredibly fast, and the terrain, the topography of that community was such that it was very difficult to exit that community. And there was over, I think, 76 deaths. that resulted, and largely seniors, people with disabilities. And it taught us a lot. It was literally a game changer for California, because I think that's what really inspired, I think, our governor to think, wait a minute, we have really got to look at wildfires through a much more robust lens of preparedness.
Yeah, it's funny. It's not funny. My grandparents lived there for many, many years in an old mobile home. And so I would spend a lot of time, probably, I don't know, the 70s and 80s. I'm dating myself, going up there. And
it's gorgeous,
so I know
right?
it's totally a beautiful area, but your point about just exits and how to get out of there, it resonates with me. And crazy. I mean, I know everybody has seen the devastation that we've experienced with these fires, both in 2018 and 2017. But unless you're here, I mean, I lived a few hundred miles from Paradise, and the air quality was horrific. And that was obviously nothing compared to what they were going through, but just the impact that it had across the state.
But the only kind of silver lining with that is not only were the Paradise community members impacted by that disaster, but it had such a large footprint because of the air quality issues.
Exactly.
And what that does is that wakes up, a third of your state and says, wow, we've actually all experienced this disaster. We all want to be ready, right?
That is such a great point, because oftentimes you'll see a disaster hit one community and it's kind of like, we watch it on the news.
Exactly.
It's not in my backyard.
Right.
While that's sad, it's not impacting my daily life.
So true.
But your point, that's a great point. It's like the unintended benefit, in a weird way, is that it probably makes now your job a bit easier, because people recognize the severity of these fires. And we haven't even talked about earthquakes and other things that potentially can impact us.
Absolutely.
So, Karen, one of the things that I've really enjoyed about interviewing leaders is when they just pause for a second, and they're pretty open and transparent and honest. Is there something in your career, maybe the last 13 years, that taught you a lesson that has shaped who you are as a person and maybe the way you lead your organizations in the future?
Well, first of all, I have to say I'm really attracted to really high stakes, systems change, right? And if you're going to be in that kind of business, you have to get all the players on the same page. What I've been humbled by is how hard that piece is. We all live, especially in our kind of siloed communities, we see things from such different perspectives. And to get people from different sectors on the same page, to get people from different ethnic backgrounds, from different ages on the same page, when you're all trying to get them to embrace an approach like, let's all embrace preparedness, but have some nuance to what your community specifically needs for this, we'll have the ability to do this with this campaign. But what I've learned through my 13 years of work, of both, having great successes, but, crash and burn moments too, is it's usually because I haven't done enough work getting people on the same page, making sure that we all agree, what is the results? Are we all bought into that? What kind of change do we really want to see happen? How are we going to get there? And if there isn't agreement on that, you're not going to make it.
So if this is one of your greatest learnings, are there any tips that you have, whether it's somebody in government, corporate, anything? Because honestly, and we were talking a bit, I don't know if this is our first take or in the last 20 minutes, I actually think that's one of the biggest impediments to moving forward, because at the end of the day, we all have the same goals. Like, who is not going to want to be better prepared for the next natural disaster? There's maybe there's one person out there, but there's probably very few. It's really more in the how, right? And maybe the underlying why for each of those different represented groups. Is there anything that you've seen that may work in terms of getting groups on the same page?
I mean, I've learned a lot, because I've learned from my mistakes, and I've learned from what's worked. I mean, I think on the how side, how we do social change, in this case, trying to make sure every Californian is truly prepared, it means you have to go out into the communities, and you have to listen, and you have to educate, and you have to spend time, and you have to understand that the way that, for example, the Vietnamese community may want to be connected to each other, and be able to be prepared is going to look totally different than a group of seniors from Lake County, half of whom have disabilities, and how they want to be connected. So you have to truly be not a one type fits all,
right?
But like, let's really tailor this to your community.
Yeah, you know what's interesting? I wrote down 2 words here. It's actually basic hygiene, and it's listening.
Yes,
really listening. But then it's also not one of those things where you could just put out a broad communication and get everybody to come in line.
Yeah.
Or, hey, here's what we're going to do and move forward. What you're saying is you actually need to do the hard work of engaging all these different populations. And in California, I mean, that's probably even more predominant than many other states because you've got all of these little kind of microcultures, if you will, spread throughout the country or spread throughout the state.
Yes, you do. You do. It's incredibly diverse. I mean, you could have in a county, you could be dealing with, dozens of tribal communities, all of which need very unique approaches and want unique approaches. And one of the things that I think is really kind of exciting about a California that embraces its diversity is it's becoming a little bit easier to have these conversations because communities are becoming bolder about the expectation that they need and want to be engaged. Right. And it better be relevant. And if it isn't relevant, they're going to let you know. So in a weird way, that makes it easier. It's about really connecting with people that are saying, hey, I don't want to be left behind.
Yep.
I want to be included, and I want this communicated to me in a way that speaks to me.
How do you, so in this role, you live in this disaster preparedness response. It obviously has to have a big impact on you personally, your staff and your family. How do you guys all make that work?
It's about flexibility.
Yep.
I mean, always. I mean, the way that we have to make it work with the staff, I always am saying, and they know this, it's like you've got to take care of yourself. You've got to, take care of your family.
Yep.
Because if you're worried about that, you're not going to be able to show up to work.
Right.
So that's first. And then when they're doing their work, I really don't care about their hours. It's all tracked because we have to be accountable to the taxpayer, but that is up to them to decide, are they able to work a 12-hour shift, which we often move to in times of disaster?
Yep.
Or are they, they're dying at 10 hours and I've got to get someone over there to relieve them, so it's really interesting kind of just the operationalizing of like disaster work and how that happens. A lot of people don't realize just how many hours people are working over at Cal OES and all their partner agencies like CAL FIRE that are working hours that are mind-boggling.
Yeah, I wonder if there's also some linkage back, and we were talking about this off air, about linking what they do to kind of that deeper underlying cause. Any thoughts on that? Meaning like I think it's easier to motivate. This is my own personal opinion.
Yeah, sure.
Motivate and engage people when they understand the deeper why of what you're doing.
Oh, part of why, firefighters and our police officers, law enforcement, and all of these folks that teachers, I mean, you could look at almost any field where there's kind of a purpose underlying it that is about others and it's about service. I mean, it motivates people to go well beyond, the 8-hour day.
It does. But you know what I think is a challenge is there's sometimes those fields like teaching. So my wife's a teacher, my sister's a teacher. It sometimes gets lost.
Yes.
And so it's always kind of reconnecting people to why they're doing what they're doing in the first place.
Yes, yes. And they often can get very burnt out and understandably so. We have to be able to like rejuvenate them, if you will. I agree.
Karen, let's pivot to a report that you just released called the Building Disaster Resiliency, which details the challenges and opportunities in disaster and also identifies how to better match. And we talked a lot about this around matching volunteers and donations to those working in the aftermath of a disaster. Can you tell us a bit about this report before we jump into some specific questions I have?
Sure, absolutely. Well, first of all, this was, I think, a very exciting opportunity for us. We were actually approached by the James Irvine Foundation, who has been just a great investor in civic work, and had contacted us, Don Howard, their wonderful CEO, and basically was really curious about what we were doing in the disaster space, and especially as it related to the private sector opportunities, both philanthropy, private engagement, and just was curious if I was interested in looking more deeply into that. I'm like, oh, absolutely, but we didn't have the resources for such a study. And he's like, I think we are interested in this. We'd like to invest. And then I've had the good fortune of working with Deloitte, and the Monitor Institute by Deloitte is just, renowned for their really thoughtful social work and their social space work, I should say. They're just phenomenal. And contacted them and worked in this great collaborative process of producing a report that involved over, 70 reports of after action reports, FEMA reports. They studied so much on this issue. They talked with literally, I would bet, 50 different players in the nonprofit, faith-based, public sector, private sector, philanthropy, to really help us understand what are the underlying opportunities. And if we're going to kind of, if you will, fix our whole disaster response efforts and some of the challenges that we faced, what should those investments really look like? So that's what the report really covers.
Sounds like you're proud of it.
I am so excited about this report.
Usually it's like you get to the end of those, you're like, oh, okay, it's done. But I think it actually came out with some really interesting observations on challenges or opportunities, however you want to couch it. So let's go through a couple of those.
Oh, great.
Opportunity, challenge number one, individuals and organizations are unprepared for disaster. So the question I have for you is, what have you seen when frontline organizations get overwhelmed in a disaster?
Well, first of all, those frontline organizations, whether they're shelters, food banks, all kinds of organizations that kind of serve high-need populations especially. First of all, you've never seen a more passionate group of people that care, and they're all in, right? Giving every day to these community of folks that they care about. And they're not literally known for taking care of themselves very well because they are just so passionate about being there, right, for their community. So what they often become is overwhelmed. They aren't able to do the planning that they need to be able to do. There hasn't been a lot of preventative work and preventative planning that really could assist them in ways that are really important, which we're going to be doing in some of the after action opportunities that we found in this report. But that's what really happens. I mean, they become completely overwhelmed with, suddenly, and I experienced this in the Northridge earthquake because I was running a homeless agency, and I went from 500 clients to 2,000 overnight. Yep. And you just suddenly, and you're at half the staff, because half of your staff is having to take care of family members in their own trauma.
That's right.
So you've got the double hit, and it's just really challenging.
So, Karen, one of the things that I am really interested in, because I've seen this both on the private and public side, is that when a disaster isn't imminent or you're not in the aftermath of a disaster, it's really hard to get people to focus on being prepared. And it's one of those things where it's like, yes, I know, like I always say, and I've said this on this podcast before, I know I need to be better prepared for the next earthquake. We know it's coming, but how well prepared are you? So how, when you're engaging with these organizations, how do you convince them that now is the time to prepare? Because it is going to happen, and we all know it's going to happen. We've been having annual disasters here in California.
Right.
So what do you do?
No, it's a great question. I mean, one is the uptick in federally declared disasters is not just kind of a little bit higher, it's extraordinary.
Right.
So in 2008, we had one federally declared disasters. Since 2013,
and is that
we've
in
had 16.
California?
Yes,
in
just California.
One in, okay,
one.
Wow.
So since 2013, we've had 16. So, I mean, it's exponentially, just like crazy town when it comes to the number of disasters.
Right.
So nonprofits are definitely thinking about this. Philanthropists are thinking about this. as they think about how are they going to really invest their dollars and support nonprofit capacity. How do they address this? We also have entities that really are helping donors who are making choices about how to give their dollars, whether it's Charity Navigator or GuideStar, entities that review nonprofits. They are very likely to come out with things like disaster seals of approval, making sure that organizations are disaster ready. So there's kind of outside pressures that are pressing against the nonprofit field, saying, and boards of directors, you better be ready. We've got to get ready. So I think people's antenna are up,
right,
and they're really ready for this message.
What guidance would you have to any board or anybody else out there that may not be sure whether or not their organization is prepared?
Well, I'm really excited to say we're going to be announcing a new corporate core, which is going to be a core of private sector companies that have come together and will be jointly creating a curriculum that will address everything from like ensuring that your physical plant is ready, that your technology, your financial things are in line, your HR is set up, your communication. Do you know how to message to your client base, to your volunteer donor base, and ensuring that really everything is ready. And that's all going to be done pro bono by our corporate community in California.
Well, what I love about that is just serving a lot of private employers or private organizations is some have unbelievable plans, right?
Amazing.
And they test them annually. And then there's some that have absolutely nothing. So actually by creating this corporate core, not only will you bring them together so that there's a better alignment with what people are doing, but the ability to just share best practices right off the bat is significant. That's awesome.
That's literally a finding from this report. We had to come up with a strategy with this report to address the fact that these frontline organizations aren't ready. So this isn't just a report that's going to sit on a shelf. This is already a report where we're out there recruiting companies to join the corporate core and get this curriculum rolling.
What's great about what you're doing, and that's just one example, but it's not like some big Sacramento bureaucratic disaster preparedness effort. You're actually pushing this down into the communities and to companies.
Oh, absolutely. And what we're finding with corporations, gone is the day where the corporation wants to have the morale building, volunteer event where we clean a beach and feel closer as a team.
Right.
They're really interested in high impact, system changing work. They want to make sure in the case of disaster that they're not just there right after in response, but is there a role they could have played in prevention to really prepare the nonprofits that are on the front line. So
Absolutely.
It's great.
Challenge number 2. Once again, it sounds like a game show. Insufficient coordination, waste resources. We've talked a bit about this before, but what do you think can be done, or what are you planning to do to enhance coordination?
Well, there really is an insufficient coordination of local resources. One of the biggest challenges we had in Butte County with the Paradise Fire that happened there in this last year was that there wasn't a VOAD that had been stood up, which is a volunteer organization active in disaster, which is the typical coordinating body for all those organizations that are in that kind of disaster business that typically meet on a regular basis in a community if they have a VOAD. So there are not enough VOADs set up in our counties. There should be one in every county. We've
Is
got
that something
counties.
that you're beginning to look at
Absolutely.
to see where there's potentially some white space or
Exactly.
opportunities?
And we need, donors who would support, simple convenings of those players, even if it's on a quarterly basis. Because in the heat of a disaster moment, it's just so complicated to work together if you've never met, if you haven't planned together. So that's why that VOAD structure is so critical.
So if you're listening to this podcast and you live in California, or even if you don't, because these type of structures,
it's a national frame from FEMA.
So what would you recommend? Like, I work for Deloitte, or if you work for another organization, what could they do hearing what you just said?
Yes. First of all, I would be in touch with the county emergency manager in the county where you live. Find out if they are in touch with or are aware of a local VOAD, volunteer organization active in disaster, and if there's a way that you could play a helpful role in helping that organizations become more effective, efficient, be able to assist them, maybe even providing simply a space where they can meet. It could be just something very simple, actually.
I think what's great about this as well is if you're at a private company and you've got these every organization's got these efforts where they give back to the community.
That's right.
And I think what you're also saying is that's great. Like, don't necessarily stop that.
Yeah.
But be really thoughtful about how you potentially could contribute to things like disaster preparedness.
Yes,
and you could take the
absolutely.
lead because that will have the biggest impact in times of need.
It is so important. I mean, the one thing I will just say is kind of a word of warning to the private sector players.
Yep.
I love the passion, the knowledge that they bring to the game. I think there's got to be just an understanding of that added little piece of humility you've got to have, recognizing that the nonprofit that you're entering has a culture of how they do their work, how they go about assisting the people they assist.
Yeah.
And just be sure to be a learner, that enters that space and is sensitive to that.
It goes back to what we talked about earlier. It's empathy. Empathy for understanding who they are, what their mission is, and how they work.
Yes, really important to respect that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I could see us coming in. It's like, oh, well,
gangbusters.
We know exactly what we need to do. We know process and methodology and deployment of resources. So,
yeah.
Thank you for the caution.
The truth is you guys do know so much that our nonprofits need and our faith-based organization. It is not even funny how much they want and need it. But I think there is a little bit of a fear of, will they be respected in that partnership?
Right. Well, it goes back to also it's the difference between the what you need to do and how you do it. And I think it's like being very thoughtful in the how.
I love you, Mike, because that's spot on. Yeah.
Cool. All right. Well, I feel good about myself now. Okay. So challenge number 3, unplanned efforts get in the way of emergency response. Can you give me an example of something that just gets in the way?
So what gets in the way and creates this second wave of disaster are unbelievably, loving, compassionate, caring companies that decide to load trucks with stuff.
Yep.
And just drive into the middle of a disaster zone with the hope that they can deliver product in a way that will be helpful. In Butte, there was a famous story of, we unfortunately lost a lot of schools in that fire. And there was a supplier of school desks who tried to literally send in 1,000 new school desks in the middle of a community that, first of all, there was limited warehousing space, so where the heck are we going to put those? Where are we going to have volunteers that can help unload those trucks when we need volunteers to do sheltering and food distribution? So it's just creating this whole second wave of disaster. So you really do need to check with that local, recovery coordinator at the EOC, the Emergency Operational Center at the county, to really find out, what's needed. Is this the right moment in time?
Yeah, God, it's so hard because people want to respond in a moment of disaster. So that their heart's in the right place. What you're just saying is just check to understand what's needed.
Yeah.
And you'll be able to marshal your resources so much more effectively.
It's so true. It's so true. Because we do need those resources. I don't want to say no to the resources. It's just the when and the how.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so number 4 challenge. Critical community needs aren't met. So what type of needs do you see aren't typically met in a time of disaster?
Well, first of all, there's some populations that have really unique challenges that are difficult to meet. Yep. So let's say you've got undocumented folks in a community that might not trust that they can go to a local shelter because they're worried. Are there going to be, ICE agents there? But they have really important dire needs that need to be met, whether it's, medical needs, whether it's sheltering needs, food, and they're just worried for their families. So you have to look at special populations and how they need to be addressed in a way that is really sensitive and, someone that they would trust.
I would say what's interesting, it goes back to, it's not even necessarily into disaster. Once again, it goes back to preparedness because, of course, that's probably not going to happen. And I don't want to politicize this, but but it's probably not going to happen. But that doesn't matter. It's what they believe. And so they will not go to that local shelter because a concern of, them thinking it potentially could. And so it goes back to your point earlier where the outreach to these groups is so very critical so that you understand what are their worries, concerns, so that you can address them
proactively,
so that when the disaster hits, everybody knows what they need to do and they're comfortable.
Amen. And then there were needs that weren't met. They were able to be met eventually, but really challenging needs in that community. We're talking about the Camp Fire in Butte County. There was a large number of animals, pets, specifically dogs and cats, that not only had to be fed and have, cages, but they had to be walked daily.
Right.
So can you imagine the team of volunteers that were needed for 1,300 pets? Because these are animals that often, left their owners in the middle of this fire.
Right.
People had multiple dogs. And then if they are now having to live on the couch of a friend in a neighboring community, let's say in Chico, they don't want to, burden that household with their 3 dogs.
Right.
So this is not just a couple weeks in a sheltering situation. These are animals that have to be sheltered for months. So this is a really big task with a lot of volunteers, a lot of resources that are needed. So that's another unmet community need that we have got to be addressing.
So you've had this opportunity to go through creating this report. You've obviously spent 13 years in this. You're transitioning to a new role. And obviously there's a lot of work to be done. Is there something that when you step back and you go, I'm optimistic because of what's happening in California for our ability to deal with these? Because a lot of the conversation is, oh my gosh, there's so many more disasters. We're just not prepared. What are you optimistic about?
Well, I'm incredibly hopeful because we've got in this report kind of 3 buckets of solution.
Yep.
And what's great is people are lining up ready to solve for it. So it's not just a sweet report. It's a report that is actionable. For example, Philanthropic California, which is a great collaboration of Northern California grant makers, Southern California grant makers, and San Diego grant makers, are coming together and realizing philanthropists need to be educated about disaster, how to make the right investment, who to invest with, when to invest. How do we lean more toward maybe recovery investments with so many individual donors investing during the response time? Is philanthropy's better lane in either preparedness or recovery? Right? So that's really interesting, and it's a wonderful commitment they're making.
That is such a great example because there was actually one organization that we worked with. I'm not going to mention who it is, but one of the things that they struggled with during the Napa-Sonoma fires of a couple of years ago is, where do we put our money?
Yes.
And there wasn't really precedence, or they didn't know what groups really needed it. And then they created the expectation in the future from other communities that they were going to give the same amount. And so it just was like the heart was in the right place, but they just didn't have that structure. So the fact that you're actually bringing all of these different groups together is incredible.
It's really important that our philanthropy partners become really educated about this and grow in their sophistication about this because, they're insanely generous.
Yep.
They want to do it right and well. And the communities need these resources. Desperately need these resources. But we've got to give them, the right resources at the right time, in the right way, to organizations that are not predatory. They've got to be, established entities, foundations that can receive those funds and spend them responsibly.
I'm going to go off on a tangent. I didn't tell you about this before.
No, go for it.
Okay, here we go. So it's interesting because one of the things you keep going back to is you did this analysis, you put out this report, but you keep saying, oh, it's not going to go on a shelf and it's actually going to be actionable.
Yeah.
And this could apply to any type of organization. What happened this time? And I'm not suggesting that it happened other times and it wasn't successful, but for you personally, what were the ingredients that made this time successful? Was it burning platform? Was it the right people involved? What would you say has made it so that you can actually take these observations, challenges, and recommendations, and you actually seem pretty damn confident that something's going to come out of it?
I'm very confident. first of all, what happened is we made sure we set the table with all the people that have to have both buy-in and both, whether they're at the grass tops or the grass bottoms.
Yep.
It's people that literally need to have a voice in defining the opportunities.
Yep.
So you don't have to be bothered with the distraction of folks saying, well, wait a minute, I wasn't a part of it.
Yeah.
That's a whole, thing we all have to often deal with. So people were included. There was both one-on-one interviews, but there was then group time. So there was 2 group sessions that were held. So people could actually, take issue with each other, really kind of grapple with it. And that's where the Monitor Institute by Deloitte was really helpful, because you really need a professional entity that can facilitate those kinds of discussions in a way that is sophisticated.
Right.
Because people have to feel, honored, respected, but it also has to be set up.
But
right.
But it sounds like there's 2 things. One, you engage them.
Yay.
Which,
Totally
sometimes
important.
engagement can be superficial.
Yes.
And the second thing you said was we actually listened to them and allowed them to have those deeper conversations so that it got us to focus on the right things when we ultimately did fill in those gaps in. But once we ultimately got down to the research.
No, absolutely true. Absolutely true. And then when we started to kind of land on what we think some of the right solutions were, the right opportunities for impact, these kind of 6, areas that we've identified, like developing disaster-wise funders being one of them. We started then going back to the players that play in that space, like Philanthropy California, and had a conversation with them. Are you ready to take action in that space? And can we secure your commitment before we even release this report? Do you want to be part of the team that makes that happen? Yes. So that it's done even before the report is released.
Right. So that you went through the report released, you can have confidence when somebody said, oh, that's a great recommendation, but that will never happen.
Right.
It's like, no, let me tell you exactly how it's going to happen.
Yes. And yet we know some of these actions can't happen unless there's more investment from either philanthropy or from the legislature. There's ideas in here that, electeds could look at and say, wow, VOADs, these volunteer organizations active in disaster that we need set up in all counties, there isn't state money for that? Mm-hmm. Well, that's strange. We should create a bill, and that could become either something that's funded through government, getting a competitive grant process out there, or it can be funded by philanthropy.
So where can people find this report? And one of the things that before you answer, this is not an advertisement for Deloitte, because there's many other organizations that could have helped you. And that's been always important to me about this podcast. We just happen to be connected on this. But where can people find this? Because you're saying that we're essentially putting out a pretty instrumental report in helping California be better prepared for the next natural disaster. My hope, if I were you, is somebody's going to listen to this and it may change what they do.
Yes.
If they want to learn more about this, other than just, sending Karen an email, what do they do?
Which I'm always welcome to get all your emails. I think to learn more about this, it's best to go to press office at cv.ca.gov.
Okay. And we'll put that in the little show notes or whatever the heck we do. But yeah, I think it's important because it would be great to spur action for somebody that's listening to this to maybe do something different than what they're doing today.
Yeah, if you want to boost community resilience, if you want to be engaged in this, that's where to go.
We talked about California for All earlier when you talked about some of the new things that you're doing. I have a few questions that I want to go back to now that we've covered all of this other great stuff. So on the California for All initiative, would I even call it an initiative program? What would you call it?
I mean, I really think it's a key theme throughout the Gavin Newsom administration.
Okay.
There's going to be a lot of different initiatives that use the California for All banner.
Yep.
Because it really captures the governor's interest in a all-inclusive, all-in justice, affordability, for all kinds of efforts.
So there's the California for All. Now this is focused on emergency preparedness. And let's talk. Okay.
Yeah.
So now, so how do you think, and we probably have touched on a lot of this, so this may be going through a few things that we've talked about, but how do you think this specific area of focus, your life now, how is that going to help people that are out there that may be disadvantaged, may not be prepared for a disaster, but what specifically is this focus going to do?
I think this is the first campaign that's been waged in California that has been designed out of the chute with an interest in reaching very diverse communities with a tailored effort that will work with their community. Meaning, how do they communicate with each other? Are they a group of Armenian men who meet at a coffee shop, and that's how their community connects? Are they instead a group of promotoras from the Latina community who are doing health education that suddenly realize they want to be involved in disaster preparedness work and might become Listos volunteers, teaching 8 hours of family preparedness? Just what is going to be the right method for connecting with their community and getting them engaged in this California for All emergency preparedness campaign.
So I'm curious, like the push versus the pull. Obviously, you're probably going through a process to identify who those kind of archetype groups are.
Right.
Maybe can you just touch on that?
Sure. So first of all, we ran a competitive grant process where there was a lead CBO, community-based organization, from identified counties, 6 target counties, 2 in the north, 2 in the central, 2 in the south, and then had an additional competitive process for other counties that were not identified.
So those
as
are like the highest risk of 6
Correct.
initially. Okay. So then
Correct.
you say, so you put it out there.
So we put it out there and then said, okay, other counties, we've got additional funds. Let us know if you want to compete for that. So you could either have been in the identified county or you could be in the competing group.
And that money, the grant making's been done at this point in time, right? Okay.
Correct.
Is there thoughts that maybe there will be more in the future? So
our hope is after we spend this $50 million over an 18-month period, that other counties are going to say, hey, wait a minute, what about us?
Right.
Or, hey, existing counties are going to say, these resources changed the game for us. And this, we believe, needs to continue. So there may very well be ongoing resources, but at this point, it was one-time money.
And how are you going to measure, if you don't mind me asking,
please.
the impact? Because I think a lot of times people are curious about that. Like, we spent all this money from the government. How can we measure whether or not it made an impact or made a difference?
Well, first of all, we're literally counting to make sure that we literally reach the 1 million Californians. Yeah. And what we're going to be tracking is not only, how were they engaged? Was it a gathering after church where they had a group of 30 people that took a 1-hour California for All emergency preparedness campaign curriculum that we designed? Is it going to instead be people that were educated by door-to-door AmeriCorps members, literally going door to door in rural communities, because often folks might not want to feel as comfortable coming together to community events. They moved to certain areas of the state because they wanted to be in a much more private space. So we might have to go and do much more proactive outreach in some of these communities. So we're connecting with them. We'll have a data management vendor who will then take all the data and be able to tell us exactly on the front end what was, the reality of what actions they had taken, and then on the back end what had changed. We have, materials we'll be distributing, whether it's going to be refrigerator magnets or wallet guides. We're going to be asking communities, how do you want this list of helpful hints or best contact numbers or places to go for help? What is the best thing that works for your community?
Once again, it's always tailored.
It's always tailored. And so once we, get those resources out, that's a whole nother kind of value add. So if there's, let's say, a refrigerator magnet that lives on your refrigerator that tells you, this is my alert and warning system, this is my evacuation route, this is what I pack, if I do have to leave my home, that's extremely helpful because you don't have to dig around and find it. It's on your refrigerator.
Well, I think what's refreshing too is how granular you're getting. about measuring impact? Because that's the question people always have.
Absolutely.
And I'm guessing you coming into this role, especially, or continuing to do this work,
Sure.
you're going to want to know, hey, did we actually achieve what we set out to? And to be able to connect directly with a million people, not at a wide level, but like you said, on a very micro focus level is impactful.
Well, and one of the really key parts of the design, aside from that community-based organization that's going to have sub-grants to the smaller CBOs that reach the pockets of that county and their unique makeup, is also going to be the augmentation of some civic resources. We have CERT teams, community emergency response teams.
Yep.
We have AmeriCorps. We have the Listos program, which is this family education program, an 8-hour program. We've got fire safe councils. We've got these wonderful civic assets that have also been funded that will be partnering with that CBO and with these local CBOs to be providing assistance and training and boots on the ground. So, I mean, it's really this truly grassroots, and it's going to be your neighbor that's going to be educating you. It's not going to be someone from the state. It's, it's your neighbor.
Well, and it's a neighbor, once again, you trust.
That's right.
You also have this opportunity, this incredible opportunity to learn.
Yes.
To learn about how people are prepared or not prepared, things that they put into place, and potentially the effectiveness long term.
Yes, and all of it will be message tested, and I mean, there's going to be a sophistication to the marketing campaign part of it, which I think is really exciting.
So, what are you most building off of that exciting?
Yeah.
As part of all of this, what are you most excited about? Like in terms of kind of this very focused, programmatic approach, leveraging money that you've got, this big grant. What are you most excited about? Is there anything, and maybe it's something we've talked about or maybe something that we haven't?
Sure.
What?
Well, I'll tell you what's excited me the most to date, and that's been when we've reached, I think, especially non-English speaking communities that are so keenly interested in this content, and they get so excited that they can actually prepare their own families for disaster preparedness. They feel much more a part of the community. So our great partnership with Listos, that content, that 8-hour family preparedness training is going to be translated in the 5 languages that most Californians who do not decide and cannot speak English, how can we reach you in your native language? So it will be translated in Chinese, Vietnamese, Korean, Armenian, and Tagalog. So to be able to reach communities that sometimes have not maybe felt as much a part of the whole emergency preparedness world,
right? Because
they're going to be reaching it. We're going to be reaching them in their culturally appropriate format, right? Let alone a significant investment that's been made to our tribal communities. And that makes a huge difference. So you're just seeing what excites me is people that have not typically been engaged and there hasn't been the dollars to engage them.
Right.
There's now money to engage them, and it's very targeted to that end.
Well, and the exponential effect could be significant because you're making this initial investment and they're going to tell their friends who are going to tell their family, and you could potentially grow this.
This is great that way. And then if you think of that as an asset, once they've had an experience with the state government where they go, my gosh, they actually cared about, how I feel about receiving my preparedness information, how I'm going to be being handled during response. Imagine how that could be applied to different issues.
Totally.
I mean, it totally can be applied to other things. So this is about engaging Californians, all Californians, in a whole new way.
In a targeted way. That's fantastic. Yeah. Let's close with some questions.
Sure.
So we're getting towards the end. The first question, and this is a question I did not share with you, so we can always stop and whatever. But I actually, as I've reflected on all of these interviews that I've done, one of the things that I've found is that I believe people, leaders in particular, find out about themselves in difficult times. Mm-hmm. And has there ever been a time where you look back in your career and you said, wow, that was a challenge, but it taught me some of the most important lessons?
Yes. I mean, I think making the transition from each governor has been really challenging because you really have to look at their agenda. And as much as you have your own, that really has to take a back seat because you have to really realize, okay, this governor is going to have their own view about the portfolio of work that I'm responsible for. And how am I going to connect with that? You know, how am I going to make it relevant? So there's some real humility that you have to have and you have to realize in order to do that in I would say in a graceful way. You know?
Well, and I think we were talking about this offline, so I'm really glad you brought this up because that comment pertains to anybody out there.
Right?
And I don't care if you're, you know, at the beginning of your career or if you've been in a role many, many years and you're a CEO. The fact of the matter is we all go through transitions.
Yes.
And it's how we handle them. And do we handle it with grace? Do we actually think about what that other party needs? Do we think about how we could position a point of view that maybe is not all about me, but is about the organization or the state or whomever it is?
That's right.
And what I also find, God, I feel like I'm pontificating now,
No, it's
but the
helpful.
more you think less, or the less you think about yourself and the more that you think about, you know, whoever that stakeholder is. So in this case, Gavin or Governor Newsom, the irony is probably the more you're going to be successful.
Yes.
Because if you position what you can do to help them, the likelihood is you're probably going to find yourself on the end of a better position. And even if you don't, you're going to be in a position where you said, well, at least I tried to help them think about the issues that were important to them. I presented some potential solutions. And if they didn't take it, that's fine. Move on to the next thing.
And you know why that's important? That's so spot on. You know, the people of California voted for the governor.
Right.
And it's honoring the people and saying, it's not about me, it's about them and their vote for this wonderful leader. And this leader deserves to have as much background, as much knowledge, so he or she can make, you know, an informed decision about what the agenda is.
Absolutely. Yeah, and you know what? The thing I always tell people, I'm in a role now where some things are transitioning. It's like change, if you use it, you know, opportunistically, can be the best thing for you.
Yes. I actually crave it.
Yeah. Yeah. There's people like you and me that crave it, and there's other people that are like, oh, why?
Oh my God, no.
Why? Yeah,
Right?
you people annoy me. Okay, so let's talk about, and this is a question that I've asked of many people. It kind of is good. Sometimes it's a challenge, but it's probably my favorite one. So the cliche question is, and I want to hear your cliche answer.
Sure.
But like, how do you define success? But what I'm always more interested in is, what do you take out of the cliche answer of what success is? And the reason why I ask that is I try to get to what is most important to that individual and really how they think about success.
Yeah.
So what do you say?
So my first answer would be, I love success. To me is high stakes work. I mean, really important issues that's creative with diverse stakeholders where we're going to solve a problem and it better be fun.
Yep.
Got to have all that for it to be really successful.
Why do you say so? Many people may say somebody in your position where fun is in your definition, it may feel like it's incongruent with what other people would say success is.
I would literally say that you're missing like one of the critical element. That's not the one that I would take out, by the way. If it isn't fun, just people don't, when they're in a joyful place, when they're feeling like it's easy to contribute and there's kind of a relaxed format that you've set, a vibe that you set as you set the tone and the culture.
Yep.
You just get a whole different level of wisdom, a whole different level of play and interplay that gets to happen between all the stakeholders you've brought together. I think that's literally the magic.
And when we say fun, I mean, because I think you and I are wired the
Yeah.
same way. It's not necessarily just like fun,
Not
like
joke
birthday
telling,
parties,
right.
Or going out for cocktails. But it's
Right.
like, do I find, am I fulfilled in joy from this activity that I'm
Yes.
engaging in? And we've all been in that position where we work for somebody who takes all of the joy out of it. And it's actually not only miserable, but you actually don't do good work because you're always looking over your shoulder, right? If like, am I impressing them? Am I doing the right thing? And I think when you're in that light atmosphere, it's good. And you know what part of it is? Yes, like we're talking about disaster preparedness and response, but sometimes we also take ourselves way too seriously in the day to day.
It's so true. It's so true. And it's about the fun.
What would you take out? What's
I think the one thing I'd take out if I had to was the high stakes. I mean, I'll give you an example. This last weekend, I organized a car wash at my kid's school. I would not say that's high stakes work,
right?
But it's community organizing that had to be creative because we didn't have a lot of resources. It had diverse stakeholders because there was all kinds of parents of very different ethnic backgrounds and very different parts of our community that I was working with. We were solving the problems, how to raise money, and I had to make it fun. So it wasn't high stakes in that, I'm not solving our foster care system issues. But if I had to take one thing out, I would say that's the one thing that, it's ultimately super fulfilling if it's high stakes stuff.
Right. I think actually, let me just break that down a little because I think there's something really important there. What you're not saying is like, listen, if I am engaged in a high stakes activity, I want to succeed. And that does actually generate success or it contributes to my success. But what I think you're saying is that's not necessarily a prerequisite.
Correct.
Meaning if I lived a life where it wasn't high stakes after high stakes incident, that I could feel like I'm making an impact on this world because I am doing other things. And sometimes people get so caught up, I think.
Yes.
And like, it's got to be like the thing that's hitting the front page. And if it's not, then I'm not worthy.
Then I'm not
a
player or I'm not.
Exactly.
And to me, I realize, if I can have a successful car wash so that the 8th grade class can go to Washington, D.C., that's awesome.
Right.
That's fulfillment.
Right.
No, absolutely.
Okay, so we named this podcast Resilient for a reason. So I would say you're a resilient leader. But what would you say are some of the characteristics? And you've worked with some great governors. You've worked with a lot of people that have, I think, really embodied what resilience is. Is there a characteristic or two that you can think about that really, when you think of resilience, comes to your mind? That's the first question.
I think the first and single most important quality of a resilient leader is that they focus on the long game. It's got to be about the long game, because the short game, you're going to air out, issues of concern from various stakeholders. People aren't going to agree to the rules of the game. There's going to be tensions and stress. But if keep your eye on the long game, you're going to get through it and you are going to be resilient.
Nobody has given that answer, and here's why I like it. Actually, I was pausing. I'm like, that's an interesting one. I haven't heard that. It also allows you to be more resilient because you don't allow yourself to get knocked down on your butt by every trivial little thing. If you're always focused on, what is it that we're ultimately trying to achieve, the little things just don't matter.
You can't have them matter. Yeah. And my parents taught me this too. It's interesting. My dad, we were talking about parenting, and he said to me, the thing at the end of the day that I really realized as you kids were, especially in teenagers or in your 20s, all I cared about is the long game, that I want you to come back and spend time with us. And you're only going to come back and spend time with us if we create a non-judgmental frame where you can honestly talk about your issues, your concerns, and we're going to be able to have a real conversation. And that's my long game. And I realized that's what applies to everything. Our families are our first teachers, and that to me just stuck.
Yeah, and it's interesting, in kind of a public role that you're in, you potentially are subject to criticism all day long. But if you're really clear on what am I ultimately trying to achieve, which is a better California for all people that are actually prepared when it's win. And it'll probably be in the next 6 months when we have a big natural disaster. That's the long game you're playing.
That's exactly right.
Is there anybody that when you think of a resilient person, I'm not even using leader because it could be anybody. Is there somebody that comes to mind for you?
Well, I have a work colleague. Her name is Amua. Okay. And she's our director of AmeriCorps. She's an extraordinary resilient leader. And I say that because she has an amazing story. She was... arrived in the United States as a refugee She's from a Hmong community and came not knowing English, came and moved to Fresno, was raised in Fresno, learned English, ended up going to UC Davis, was working at a nonprofit where I bumped into where I was doing some work with the California Endowment, and worked with she was with the Hmong Women's Heritage Association and was an incredible local leader that I then grabbed when I moved over to California Volunteers. And she's now become the director of AmeriCorps through the years and has been in that position for a number of years. Has had, has 4 kids, is like resilient on so many levels, both with
she's like
parenting,
a black belt resilient
exactly,
person,
right? She inspires me every day, incredibly creative, always positive, just a joy to work with.
You know what I think her story brings out, which is another attribute, is you almost can't be resilient if you haven't had to overcome a number of life obstacles.
Pain is absolutely a prerequisite.
Pain is a prerequisite of success.
Yeah, I think
resilience.
so. Struggle, at least. Struggle and pain. Because it's when, first of all, you've got to get over your fear of it.
Yep.
You can't fear it. And if you haven't touched that enough, you probably have a little bit of a freaky feeling about it. Like, oh my gosh, will it take me down?
Right.
Whereas if you've lived through it, you recognize you are stronger than you think you are. I mean, we saw that a lot in Paradise. We saw people that didn't think they'd have the strength that had amazing strength and fortitude to kind of push through and be resilient as survivors. And I think as leaders, we've got to recognize our own resilience by being in touch with that struggle that we've had in the past. And know we're going to get through this because we're going to focus on that long game.
You know what? Maybe just closing. I cannot think of one thing in my life where I feel like I've achieved something or something good has happened where there wasn't a precursor of something that was an obstacle that I've had to overcome.
Absolutely.
Not one thing.
Yep.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for this opportunity.
Absolutely. Wow, that was incredible. First of all, for Karen to spend all that time with us, helping us understand what California is doing to be better prepared for crisis. Karen, thank you for everything. Thank you for the great stories of the governors, including, I love your anecdote, running to a Black Hawk helicopter with Governor Schwarzenegger. What you're doing to help communities prepare for disasters. I thought it was fascinating how you're really getting down to almost a micro community level and how you're tracking your investments that you're making in these efforts. I think that is extremely important for taxpayers. How the private sector can play in disaster preparedness and response. And I really loved your insights on leadership. I think you had one of the most thoughtful answers on my question around resilience, play the long game. I also want to thank everybody who subscribes and listens to Resilient, a Deloitte podcast produced by our friends at Rivet Radio. As I've shared before, you can find us at Deloitte.com, or you can visit your favorite podcatcher, iTunes, SoundCloud, Google Play, and even Spotify. Just put in Resilient. And I encourage you to check out our previous episodes, great interviews with CEOs, board members, and leaders. And if you're enjoying these conversations, please share them with your colleagues, family, and friends. And I'd be extremely grateful if you could just spend 1 minute providing a rating. Ratings play an extremely large role in how much the podcast gets promoted in places such as iTunes. Hit me up on LinkedIn or Twitter if you have any comments, questions, recommendations for future guests. My profile on Twitter is mkearney33. On LinkedIn, it's just Michael Kearney. Let me leave you with a quote from William Jones that beautifully sums up Karen and her commitment to service. Act as if what you do makes a difference, because it does.